The moment my attorney turned to page 7, my husband stopped smiling. Until then, Nathaniel Whitmore had sat across the courtroom like a man watching the final scene of a play he had already paid to end. His charcoal suit was flawless, his silver watch caught the morning light from the tall courthouse windows, and his expression carried that quiet billionaire confidence that made people lower their voices around him. He thought I had signed away everything. The penthouse, the settlement, the business protections, the last piece of leverage I had, and most painfully Harper Books, the small brick storefront on West 73rd Street that still smelled like old paper, cedar shelves, and my mother's vanilla hand cream. Nate believed the contract was a cage, and he believed I had walked into it willingly. Maybe part of me had. 3 years earlier, I had been desperate enough to sign papers thicker than a church Bible if it meant saving my mother's bookstore from foreclosure. Now I sat in family court with my hands folded over the same worn leather purse I had carried back then. The purse with a broken zipper and a fountain pen inside. The last good pen my mother ever owned. Beside me, Grace Miller, my attorney, did not fidget. She did not whisper dramatic warnings or slam folders on the table. She simply waited with the calm of a woman who knew the truth did not need to rush. Across the aisle, Nate leaned toward his own attorney, Richard Vail, and murmured something that made Richard's mouth tighten into a pleased little line. Richard had built the divorce strategy like a luxury building. Cold, expensive, and designed so no ordinary person could find the exit. He had argued that I had understood the agreement, that I had accepted the terms, that I had no legal claim beyond what Nate chose to allow. Every page carried my signature. Every clause, Richard said, confirmed it. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and patient eyes, looked down from the bench and asked if my side had any final response before she considered the motion. That was when Nate finally looked at me. Not with love. Not even with anger. With pity. The kind rich men reserve for people they think should have known better than to challenge them. He leaned slightly across the aisle and said under his breath, "You should have read before you signed, Olivia." The words reached me softly, but they landed hard. For a second I was back in that glass office 42 floors above Manhattan. Rain streaking the windows, Richard tapping the contract impatiently, Nate standing behind him like a deal instead of a man. I remembered the weight of my mother's pen in my hand. I remembered the one request I made before signing. Harper Books stays safe. No matter what happens between us, that store cannot be used against me. Back then, Nate had looked at me differently. Almost human. Almost kind. Grace rose from her chair. The courtroom quieted. She picked up the original agreement. Not the clean copy Richard had displayed, but the thick cream-colored contract with blue ink signatures, coffee shadow on the corner, and one page slightly softer from where my hand had rested too long. "Your Honor," Grace said, her voice steady enough to make Richard glance up. "Opposing counsel has spent the morning discussing what Mrs. Whitmore signed. We agree the signatures matter. That is exactly why we would like the court to read the section they skipped." Nate's smile faded by a fraction. Richard straightened. Grace turned one page, then another, slowly enough that the sound of paper seemed to fill the room. "Page 7, Your Honor." The judge leaned forward. Nate's eyes moved to Richard. Richard's face had gone still. And in that tiny silence, before anyone read a single word aloud, I knew the door Nate thought he had locked had just opened from the inside. 3 years before the courtroom went silent over page 7, Harper Books was 30 days away from losing its lights. I still remember the sound of the phone ringing that morning, sharp and relentless, while I stood on a small ladder dusting the top shelf of the poetry section. Outside, rain ran down the front windows of the store in crooked lines, blurring the yellow taxis and umbrellas moving along West 73rd Street. Inside, the air smelled like wet coats, old pages, roasted coffee from the cafe next door, and the vanilla hand cream my mother used to keep behind the register. That smell hurt the most. She had been gone 8 months, but sometimes I would turn too quickly and expect to see her there, wearing her green cardigan, telling a customer that the right book always finds the right person if you give it enough time. The phone stopped, then started again. I climbed down, wiped dust from my hands, and answered with the cheerful voice I used when the world was falling apart. It was the bank. Again. The man on the line used polite words, but the meaning was brutal in its simplicity. Past due. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings. 30 days. I thanked him because my mother had raised me to be kind even when people delivered bad news for a living, Then I hung up and stared at the framed photograph beside the register. Mom stood in front of the store on opening day, younger than I was now, holding a cardboard sign that said Harper Books, Grand Opening, All Dreamers Welcome. I pressed my fingers against the counter and tried to breathe. The store was not just a business. It was where I learned to count change, where I did my homework behind stacks of used mysteries, where lonely neighbors came on Thanksgiving because Mom always accidentally made too much pie. It was the last place in Manhattan where I still knew exactly who I was. By noon, the rain had turned heavier. Customers were scarce. I was sorting donated children's books near the front table when the bell over the door rang. I looked up and saw Nathaniel Whitmore for the first time. He did not belong in my store. Men like him belonged in glass towers, private elevators, and magazine covers that used words like visionary and empire. His black overcoat was dry despite the storm. His shoes probably cost more than my monthly rent, and the driver waiting outside kept the engine running beside the curb. He walked in without browsing, without pretending to care about books, and placed a white business card on the counter between us. "Olivia Harper?" he asked. "Depends who is asking." His eyes flicked to the shelves, the patched armchairs, the handwritten staff recommendations taped to the wall. "Someone who can keep this place open." I should have told him to leave. I should have known salvation never walks in wearing a custom coat and asking for your full name. But desperation makes pride feel expensive. Nate explained it quietly. His grandfathers will required him to be married for 3 years before he could fully control a block of voting shares in Whitmore Development Group. He needed a wife with a clean public image, no scandal, no powerful family trying to negotiate, no interest in becoming famous. I almost laughed. "You need someone invisible." He did not deny it. "I need someone practical." In exchange, he would pay the bookstore's debt, settle the back taxes, cover my mother's remaining medical bills, and guarantee the store stayed open. No romance. No expectations. Public appearances only. 3 years, then a quiet divorce. I looked at the card, then at my mother's photograph, then at the rain washing the city gray beyond the window. "And what do I lose?" I asked. Nate paused just long enough for me to understand that he had already calculated the answer. "Time," he said. "Privacy. Maybe the life you thought you were going to have." It was the first honest thing he said to me. By closing time I had not agreed, but I had not thrown the card away either. I locked the door, turned off the front lights, and sat alone behind the counter with the business card beside my mother's fountain pen. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, I listened to the old store settle around me, every creak of wood sounding like a memory asking what I was willing to sacrifice to keep it alive. The contract was waiting for me 2 nights later on the 42nd floor of a midtown law office, thick enough to feel less like an agreement and more like a wall. Rain covered the windows in silver streaks, and Manhattan glittered below us like a city made for people who never worried about overdue bills. Richard Vail sat at the head of the conference table, his cuff links shining, his voice smooth with impatience. Nate stood near the glass with one hand in his pocket, watching the traffic far below as if this entire conversation were only another acquisition. I sat across from them with my mother's fountain pen resting in front of me. It looked small on that polished table. Old black barrel, gold clip. Tiny scratch near the cap from the year. I dropped it behind the register during the holiday rush. Mom used to sign donation receipts with it, birthday cards with it, letters to customers who had moved away but still ordered books from her because they trusted her taste more than any online review. That pen had never signed away anything. Richard slid the document toward me. "The terms are standard," he said. 3 years of marriage, shared residence, limited public obligations, mutual discretion, no claim to premarital assets, no claim to future appreciation of Whitmore Holdings, and a structured exit after the anniversary date. He spoke quickly, as if speed could make the words less sharp. I turned the first page, then the second, then the third. Nate finally glanced over. "You can have your own attorney review it." Richard's mouth tightened, like he hated that Nate had said anything kind. I looked up. "With what money?" The room went quiet for half a breath. Nate looked away first. I kept reading. The contract was full of clean sentences built to hide ugly possibilities. If I missed an appearance, penalties. If I spoke to the press, penalties. If I embarrassed the Whitmore name, penalties. If the marriage ended early for reasons attributed to me, reimbursement. Richard had left nothing soft inside it. By page 6 my hands were cold. By page 7 I stopped. There was a paragraph about associated business interests, marital optics, and reputational leverage. The language was dense, but I understood enough. Harper Books could be treated as connected to the agreement if its survival depended on funds from Nate. I closed the contract. No. Richard blinked. Excuse me. No, I said again, quieter but steadier. The bookstore is not leverage. It is not collateral. It is not a public relations prop. It is my mother's life and the only home I have left. Richard smiled like I was a child asking the ocean not to be wet. Miss Harper, without Mr. Whitmore's funds, your store will likely be under bank control within a month. Then let the bank take it before I hand it to someone who might use it against me later. Nate turned from the window then. For the first time that night he really looked at me. Not at the debt. Not at the usefulness. At me. What do you want? He asked. I touched the pen, grounding myself in the weight of it. A written protection. Absolute. If you or anyone acting for you ever tries to use Harper Books to threaten me, punish me, pressure me, or take back control, then your property claims under this agreement become void. The store stays mine. The debt payoff becomes final. No clawback. No hidden lien. No clever wording from him. Richard let out a short laugh. That is not how serious contracts are drafted. Nate walked to the table and picked up the pen before Richard could stop him. Then we will write it plainly. He opened the contract to page 7, crossed out a line, and in blue ink wrote the words himself, slower than I expected, his handwriting sharp and controlled. Harper Books shall not be used, directly or indirectly, as a means of coercion, retaliation, or financial pressure against Olivia Harper. Any violation by Nathaniel Whitmore or his authorized representatives shall invalidate related property claims and preserve Olivia Harper's full ownership and compensation rights. Richard's face tightened. Nathaniel, that language is emotional, not strategic. Nate signed beneath it. Good. Then it should be easy not to violate. He slid the pen back to me. In that moment, foolish as it sounds now, I saw a man inside the billionaire. Not a savior. Not a husband. Just a man who understood, for 5 quiet seconds, that some things should never be turned into weapons. I signed because of those 5 seconds. I signed because Harper Books had 30 days. I signed because my mother's pen felt warm in my hand. And I signed because I did not yet know that page 7 would become the only honest promise Nate Whitmore ever made me, and the only one powerful enough to save me when he forgot the man he had been while writing it. The wedding happened 12 days later at City Hall, not because either of us wanted romance, but because the inheritance clock did not care about dignity. I wore an ivory dress I bought off the clearance rack in a department store near Herald Square. And Nate wore a dark suit that looked like it had been made for him by someone who measured power for a living. Richard Vail stood beside us as a witness, checking his watch twice during the ceremony. When the clerk asked if we took each other as husband and wife, Nate said yes with the same calm voice he used to approve construction budgets. I said yes while thinking about Harper Books, the foreclosure notice in the drawer, and my mother's photograph behind the register. There was no kiss worth remembering. No music. No flowers except the small bouquet a City Hall employee handed me because another bride had left it behind. That should have told me everything. But after the debt was paid and the bank withdrew its notice, I walked into Harper Books the next morning and found the lights still on, the front window still glowing, the bell over the door still ready to ring. For that, I convinced myself the bargain had been worth it. Moving into Nate's penthouse was like stepping into a beautiful hotel room where no one had ever laughed. The private elevator opened into white marble, glass walls, steel art, and silence so perfect it felt professionally installed. From the living room, Manhattan spread beneath us in glittering blocks, taxis moving like sparks far below, the Hudson River catching sunset in strips of silver. Everything was expensive. Nothing was warm. The kitchen looked untouched. The bookshelves held awards, architectural models, and glossy design objects, but not a single book with a cracked spine. On my third night there, I brought a box from the store and placed 6 paperbacks on the lowest shelf in the living room. Nate noticed immediately. "Are those permanent?" he asked. I looked at the books, then at the cold perfect shelf around them. Only if they survive the neighborhood. He almost smiled. Almost. Our life settled into patterns written by the contract. Breakfast at opposite ends of the kitchen island. Public appearances twice a month. Dinner with investors when Richard said optics required it. My name on charity invitations. His hand at my back when cameras were near. We were convincing enough that society pages called me refreshing, grounded, unexpectedly charming. They did not see me changing out of borrowed gowns at midnight with aching feet, or walking to Harper Books at 7 each morning because I still opened the store myself. They did not see Nate pause outside the bookstore window one Friday evening and watch me recommend a mystery novel to an elderly customer who had forgotten her reading glasses. He came inside after she left, his coat dusted with early snow, and looked around like he had accidentally entered someone else's memory. "You know everyone here," he said. "Not everyone," I replied. "Just the ones who come back." He ran his fingers along a shelf of used classics. "And why do they come back?" I thought of my mother, of pie on Thanksgiving, of chairs pulled close during rainstorms, of people who bought one book and stayed an hour because the store made loneliness less loud. "Because this place remembers them," I said. Nate did not answer. But the next week a delivery arrived at the store. New reading lamps, paid in full, no note. I knew it was him because no one else would spend that much on lamps and forget to make them look sentimental. Slowly, against both our better judgment, the penthouse changed. A chipped blue mug appeared beside Nate's espresso machine because I hated drinking tea from porcelain cups too thin to trust. A stack of advance reader copies leaned against his steel coffee table. Fresh mint sat in the kitchen window because I made tea when I could not sleep. Nate complained once about the smell of old paper clinging to my coat, then bought a cedar bench for the entryway so I would have somewhere to set my tote. He remained difficult, controlled, and far too used to being obeyed. But sometimes, late at night, I would find him holding one of my books open without turning the page, as if the quiet inside it surprised him. I was supposed to be a temporary wife, a signature with a pulse, a practical solution to a rich man's problem. Yet somewhere between public dinners and morning walks to the bookstore, between his silence and my stubborn refusal to disappear, the contract began to feel less like the whole truth and more like the lie we were both using to stay safe. The first time I saved Nate Whitmore in public, I did it by telling the truth carefully enough that no one could call it betrayal. It happened at the Metropolitan Civic Renewal Gala. 6 months into our marriage, inside a ballroom bright with chandeliers, champagne flutes, black tuxedos, and women in gowns that moved like water under the lights. Whitmore Development Group had just announced a downtown revitalization project, the kind of project investors applauded because the renderings looked clean and expensive, with glass towers, rooftop gardens, and polished sidewalks where old storefronts used to stand. Nate stood at the podium beside a screen showing the future he wanted the city to buy. He was brilliant in that room. Controlled. Persuasive. Every sentence had weight. Every pause felt intentional. I stood near the edge of the stage in a navy dress borrowed from a stylist Richard had approved, smiling when cameras turned toward me, quiet when they did not. I had learned the rhythm by then. Smile, nod, do not reach for the microphone unless instructed. But then a young reporter near the front stood and asked the question no one in Nate's team wanted spoken aloud. "Mr. Whitmore, what do you say to small business owners who believe your project will erase the neighborhood rather than improve it?" The ballroom changed temperature. Richard stepped forward slightly. Nate's jaw tightened, and I knew the answer he was about to give because I had heard versions of it at breakfast. Economic growth. Strategic relocation. Community benefit. Words that sounded responsible and felt empty if you had ever stood behind a store counter wondering whether the rent would end your family history. Nate opened his mouth, but before he spoke, the reporter added, "Your wife owns a small bookstore. Would Harper Books survive one of your developments?" Every camera shifted to me. For one long second, Nate looked at me not as his wife, not even as Olivia, but as a variable that had escaped the spreadsheet. Richard's eyes warned me to stay silent. Maybe I should have. But I thought of my mother taping handwritten recommendations to the window. I thought of the elderly customer who came every Thursday because the store was the only place anyone remembered her late husband's favorite author. I thought of Nate standing in Harper Books with snow on his coat, asking why people came back. So I stepped to the microphone. A city does need new buildings, I said, and the room held its breath. But it also needs places that remember people before they became successful enough to be invited into rooms like this. The reporter lowered his pen. Nate did not move. I continued, keeping my voice gentle, not accusing, not polished enough to sound fake. Stores like Harper Books are not valuable because they are old. They are valuable because they hold the lives of the people around them. A child buying her first chapter book. A widower choosing a cookbook because he wants to make the meal his wife used to make. A student sitting on the floor because he cannot afford the book yet, but the owner lets him read anyway. Progress that forgets those people is not progress. It is just construction. The silence after that was terrifying. Then someone clapped. One person. Then another. Within seconds, the ballroom filled with applause, not the polite kind, but the relieved kind, as if everyone had been waiting for someone rich enough to be heard and ordinary enough to be believed. Nate turned toward me. I expected anger. Instead, I saw something more complicated. He had been protected and challenged at the same time, and he did not know which part to resent. The next morning, my words were in every business column that cared about polished billionaires and humanizing wives. Richard was furious. "You made Nathaniel look unprepared," he snapped in the penthouse kitchen. I poured mint tea into my chipped blue mug. "No, I made him look like he was listening." Nate stood by the window, reading the coverage on his tablet. He said nothing for so long that Richard finally left, muttering about messaging strategy. When the elevator doors closed, the penthouse became quiet again. Nate looked at me. "Did you mean it? Every word? Including the part about construction forgetting people? Especially that part." He set the tablet down. For once, he did not defend himself with numbers. He walked to the shelf where my paperbacks leaned beside his architectural awards, and touched the spine of a used novel with a cracked cover. "My grandfather built his first warehouse on a block where his father ran a hardware store," he said quietly. "He used to say you do not understand land until you know who swept the sidewalk before you." I waited. Nate looked almost embarrassed by his own memory. I had forgotten that. Something shifted between us that day. Not love, not yet, but a door opening a little wider. That evening, he asked me to review the community impact proposal before it went to the board. Richard hated the idea. Nate approved it anyway. And for the first time since signing the contract, I wondered whether a man who built towers for a living might still remember how to protect a small light in a window. The night the lights went out in Nate's penthouse, the city below kept shining like it had no idea our world had gone quiet. 1 minute, Manhattan was glittering beyond the glass walls. All headlights, office windows, and restless movement. The next, the penthouse slipped into darkness with a soft click. The air conditioner stopped humming, and every polished surface disappeared into shadow. I was in the library corner I had slowly claimed for myself, sitting on the floor in wool socks, surrounded by community impact reports, old bookstore invoices, and one of my mother's annotated novels open across my lap. Nate had been working at the dining table, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking less like a billionaire and more like a tired man who had forgotten how to stop. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his voice came from the dark. "Do not move. There are candles in the kitchen drawer." "I know," I said. "I put them there." He was quiet. "Of course you did." I found the candles by memory, lit 3 of them, and set them on the coffee table. Warm light bloomed across the room, softening the sharp edges of the penthouse. The steel art looked less cold. The glass walls turned black and reflective. Nate's face appeared in the candlelight, stripped of the usual armor that came from perfect lighting, perfect suits, and perfect control. He looked younger. Or maybe just lonelier. We ended up sitting on the floor because the couch felt too formal for a blackout. I made mint tea on the gas burner with a match and a dented kettle I had brought from Harper Books. Nate watched as if I were performing some complicated ritual. "You really do know how to live without a staff," he said. "I know how to live with very little," I answered. "There is a difference." He accepted the mug I handed him and looked at the steam. "Your mother taught you. Most useful things came from her." I touched the open book beside me. The margins were filled with her handwriting, small and slanted, arguing with characters as if they could hear her. She believed books were conversations that kept going after people left. Nate looked down at the page. My grandfather believed buildings were promises. That surprised me. He rarely spoke about family except in legal or financial terms. What kind of promises? He leaned back against the base of the couch, the candlelight catching the tired line of his mouth. That someone would have a place to work. A place to start. Place to come back to. Before the company became what it is now, he cared about that. And you? I asked. Nate turned the mug slowly between his hands. I cared about not losing what he built. The answer was honest enough to hurt. Rain tapped against the windows, soft but steady, making the dark penthouse feel suspended above the city. I thought about the contract folded somewhere in Richard's files, about page 7, about the strange life Nate and I had made inside boundaries neither of us dared name. When I signed, I said, I thought the contract was a cage. Maybe it was. But even inside a cage, a person can decide not to become cruel. Nate looked at me then, really looked, and the silence between us changed shape. It was not empty anymore. It was full of all the things we had both refused to say. He reached for the book, careful not to touch my hand, and read one of my mother's notes in the margin. Love is not ownership. Love is stewardship. His voice softened on the last word. She wrote that. I nodded. In almost every book. A small smile crossed his face, gone almost as soon as it arrived. She would have hated me. At first, I said. Then she would have fed you soup and asked why you were so afraid. He laughed once, quietly, and the sound startled both of us. It made the room feel human. For a moment I thought he might say it. Not love, maybe not yet, but something close to I do not want this to end. I saw it move behind his eyes, saw the fight between the man and the contract. Then the power returned. Lights flashed on, the refrigerator hummed, the penthouse became glass and steel again, and Nate stood as if the floor had turned formal beneath him. I have an early board call, he said. I nodded, gathering my papers. Of course. But before he walked away, he folded the blanket from the couch and placed it over the back of my chair, exactly where I always forgot it. It was such a small thing. Too small for a contract. Too small for a headline. But that was how Nate changed when he changed at all, not with speeches but with gestures quiet enough to deny later. And that was the danger. Because the softer he became, the more Richard Vail watched. And men like Richard did not fear love because it was sentimental. They feared it because it made powerful people harder to control. Richard Vail began his work with the patience of a man who never needed to raise his voice to ruin a life. He did not confront me. He did not accuse me in hallways or leave threats on my phone. Instead, he built a story around me, one careful document at a time. A forwarded email without context. A lunch receipt from a restaurant where I had met with the neighborhood preservation group. A blurry photograph of me speaking to a woman who, Richard later claimed, worked for a rival developer. A draft community proposal with my notes in the margin, edited until it looked less like protection for small businesses, and more like a plan to weaken Whitmore development from the inside. He waited until Nate was tired, until the downtown project was under investor pressure, until board members began asking why his wife was suddenly the public face of compassion while his company looked like the villain. Then Richard walked into the penthouse one evening with a slim gray folder, and the expression of a man delivering necessary pain. I was at Harper Books that night, leading a free reading circle in the back room. 12 folding chairs, paper cups of coffee, a plate of grocery store cookies, and a storm pressing against the windows. I did not know that 30 blocks away, Nate was standing beside the glass wall of our penthouse, reading selected pages that made me look calculating, disloyal, almost cruel. She has been meeting with people who want your project stopped, Richard said. She gave them internal language from your impact review. She has been positioning herself for the divorce. Nate did not answer. I can imagine him there because I knew that version of him too well, the man who went still when hurt found him, the man who trusted paperwork because feelings had once cost him too much. Richard knew exactly where to press. You softened because of her, he said. That is what she needed. By the time I came home, the penthouse was bright, silent, and colder than it had been in months. Nate stood at the dining table, the gray folder open in front of him. My mint plant sat on the windowsill behind him, small and green against the black city. I remember noticing it first because grief sometimes chooses strange details to hold on to. "Where were you?" he asked. I set my tote down slowly. "At the store. Reading group." "With whom?" His voice was so controlled that I understood at once. This was not a question. It was a verdict looking for a confession. "Customers. Neighbors. People who like books." He pushed one page toward me. "And people who work with Corbin Lane?" I looked down. The photograph showed me outside a cafe, speaking to a woman named Elise, who had asked for help organizing a petition to protect independent stores downtown. I had no idea she had once consulted for a rival firm. "This is not what you think." Nate laughed softly without warmth. "That is the first sentence people use when it is exactly what I think." I tried to explain the meetings, the proposal, the notes, but every word seemed to arrive already poisoned by Richard's folder. Nate listened like a judge who had sentenced me before the hearing began. Finally, he said, "Richard will file in the morning." My chest tightened. "File what?" "Divorce. Enforcement of the agreement. Asset freeze until the review is complete." "Asset freeze?" I repeated. "Nate, Harper Books pays employees on Friday." His eyes moved away from mine. "Then you should have thought of that before using my company against me." For 1 second, I saw the man from the blackout night, the one holding mint tea and candlelight, still alive somewhere behind his fear. Then he disappeared behind the billionaire again. "You will leave the penthouse tonight," he said. "A car will take you wherever you need to go." I looked around the room I had slowly made human. The books on the shelf. The chipped blue mug near the sink. The blanket he had folded over my chair. I did not take the jewelry he had bought for public events. I did not take the gowns, the handbags, or the watch Richard once called appropriate for my role. I packed 2 sweaters, my mother's annotated novel, and her fountain pen. As I closed the purse around it, Nate stood in the doorway of the bedroom and said nothing. Maybe he expected me to beg. Maybe part of him wanted me to. But Harper women did not beg men to believe the truth after choosing doubt. I walked past him into the private elevator, rain streaking the glass behind me, and when the doors began to close, I finally spoke. "You were right about one thing, Nate. I should have read before I signed." His eyes hardened. "You did sign." I held my purse tighter, feeling the fountain pen inside like a pulse. "Yes," I said. "And so did you." The elevator doors closed before he could answer, and I descended 42 floors through the glittering city, not knowing yet that the promise he had broken was already waiting for him in blue ink. The courthouse smelled like polished wood, old paper and rainwater tracked in from umbrellas. I sat beside Grace Miller with my mother's fountain pen inside my purse and the original contract on the table between us, thick, cream-colored, and heavier than it looked. Across the aisle, Nate sat with Richard Vale. Both men dressed like victory had already been tailored for them. Richard spoke first, and he spoke beautifully. That was his talent. He could make cruelty sound procedural and betrayal sound like responsible planning. He told the judge I had knowingly entered a 3-year marital agreement. He said I had accepted the debt payoff, the residence, the public benefits, and the structured exit. He said I had violated trust by communicating with parties opposed to Whitmore development. He said my bookstore, because it had survived through funds connected to the marriage, fell within the financial review. Every word was smooth. Every page he displayed looked clean. Nate did not look at me while Richard spoke. That almost hurt more than the accusations. He watched the judge, the documents, the polished surface of the table, anywhere but my face. When Richard finished, he placed both hands on the lectern and said, "Mrs. Whitmore signed every relevant page. The court does not need sentiment. It needs the agreement." The judge turned to Grace. "Ms. Miller." Grace rose slowly, buttoning her navy blazer. She did not look dramatic. She looked prepared. "Your Honor, Mr. Vale is correct about one thing. The agreement matters. The signatures matter. The original document matters most of all." Richard's smile thinned. Grace lifted the contract and walked toward the clerk. "The version opposing counsel provided to the court is complete in page count, but incomplete in emphasis. They have discussed page 1, page 3, page 11, and the exit provisions. They have avoided the handwritten clause on page 7. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Bring it forward." A quiet ripple moved through the room. Nate finally turned to Richard. Richard whispered something too low to hear, but his confidence had changed shape. Grace placed the original under the document camera, and the screen near the bench flickered to life. There it was. Blue ink. Nate's handwriting. Not typed by Richard. Not hidden in legal fog. Plain words written on a rainy night when I had still believed a promise could be stronger than power. Grace read it aloud, slowly enough for every syllable to land. Harper Books shall not be used, directly or indirectly, as a means of coercion, retaliation, or financial pressure against Olivia Harper. Any violation by Nathaniel Whitmore or his authorized representatives shall invalidate related property claims and preserve Olivia Harper's full ownership and compensation rights. The courtroom went so still I could hear the rain against the windows. Nate stared at the screen like it had turned into a mirror. Richard stood too quickly. Your Honor, that clause is informal language. It was not intended to govern the broader asset provisions. Grace turned one page back, then forward again. It is dated. It is signed by both parties. It is initialed by Mr. Vale as witness to the modification. Richard's face lost color in a way no expensive suit could hide. The judge looked at him. Did you witness this amendment? Richard cleared his throat. I witnessed the signing, yes, but the clause was never meant to trigger under these circumstances. Grace's voice stayed calm. The circumstances are exactly what the clause describes. Mr. Whitmore, through counsel, froze marital access in a way that affected Harper Books' payroll. Counsel then asserted review rights over the store as leverage in the divorce. That is financial pressure. That is retaliation. And because Mr. Vale acted as Mr. Whitmore's authorized representative, the clause applies. Nate closed his eyes. I saw the moment he remembered the law office, the rain, my mother's pen, the way he had said it should be easy not to violate. Grace was not finished. She opened a second folder. We also request the court note that the evidence of Mrs. Whitmore's alleged misconduct was materially misleading. The woman identified as a rival consultant was present at a public neighborhood meeting. The draft proposal contained no confidential Whitmore data. The edited version submitted by Mr. Vale omits context from the original file. Richard objected, but the words sounded weak. The judge asked to see the unedited documents. Grace handed them over. Minutes passed, but they felt like years. Nate looked at me then, finally. Not with pity this time. With recognition. The terrible kind. The kind that arrives after trust has already been broken. I did not look away, because I wanted him to understand that the woman he tried to corner had not beaten him with revenge. I had only kept the promise he forgot. The judge set the papers down. The court finds sufficient basis to deny enforcement of the disputed property claims pending further review. Harper Books is not to be frozen, encumbered, or treated as leverage in this matter. Payroll and operations are to remain untouched. The handwritten clause is valid for the purpose of this hearing. My breath left me so quietly no one heard. Grace touched my wrist once under the table. Richard sat down like his bones had emptied. Nate remained still, staring at page 7 on the screen. Outside, rain slid down the courthouse glass in clean silver lines, washing the city beyond it blurry. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, Harper Books was not a favor, not a debt, not a bargaining chip, not something a powerful man could hand me and take back. It was mine. And the signature that proved it belonged to the husband who had tried to forget his own humanity. After the judge ruled, nobody moved for a few seconds. Richard Vale stared at the table as if the polished wood had become more interesting than the wreckage of his strategy. Nate sat beside him, silent, shoulders squared, face pale in the courthouse light. I should have felt victorious. Part of me did. Harper Books could open tomorrow. My employees would be paid. My mother's shelves would not become a bargaining chip in a billionaire's divorce. But victory, when it arrives after betrayal, does not feel like fireworks. It feels like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath for too long. Grace gathered the papers with the quiet precision of someone who knew the battle was not fully over, only changed. There will be more hearings, she said softly. But today matters. I nodded, my hand closing around my mother's fountain pen inside my purse. Across the aisle, Nate stood. For a moment, I thought he would speak to Richard first, or walk away behind a wall of attorneys and assistants. Instead, he turned toward me. Olivia, he said. My name sounded different in his mouth now, stripped of certainty. Grace looked at me, silently asking if I wanted her to stay. I shook my head once. Not because I trusted Nate, but because I trusted myself. He approached slowly, stopping several feet away in the courthouse hallway where rain light spilled across the marble floor. People passed around us carrying briefcases and coffee cups, living ordinary lives while mine felt split open and rearranged. I was wrong, Nate said. No excuse came after it. That surprised me more than the apology itself. Yes, I said. His jaw tightened, but he accepted it. I believed Richard because the lie matched what I was afraid of. And what were you afraid of? That you had only been kind because you were waiting for the right moment to take something. I looked at him, this man who could buy buildings but had never learned how to trust a cup of tea, a used book, a woman who remembered his headaches, a quiet evening in candlelight. I did take something, I said. I took back my dignity. He lowered his eyes. I know. There were words people expect after a courtroom apology. Forgiveness. Tears. A softening that lets the man feel redeemed before he has done the work. I gave him none of that. Do not come to Harper Books until this is finished, I said. And do not make my store the stage for your regret. He nodded. Understood. Months passed. Richard was removed from the case after Grace exposed the edited documents and his role in pushing the claim against the bookstore. The final settlement protected Harper Books completely and awarded damages for the attempted financial pressure. I used part of it to repair the front window, replace the old heating system, and open a free reading corner for women rebuilding their lives after divorce, debt, or the kind of heartbreak that does not leave visible marks. I named it the Page 7 Corner, though only Grace and I knew why. On opening morning, the store smelled like fresh paint, cedar shelves, coffee from next door, and vanilla hand cream from the small bottle I had started keeping behind the register again. Sunlight fell across the new armchairs. A young woman sat near the window reading quietly, her suitcase tucked beside her feet. An elderly customer cried when she saw the restored poetry shelf. For the first time in years, Harper Books did not feel saved by someone else. It felt saved by me. Near closing, the bell over the door rang. Nate stood in the entrance without a driver, without Richard, without the armor of a boardroom. He wore a dark coat damp from the weather and held one envelope in his hand. He did not step farther inside until I nodded. You said not to come until it was finished, he said. It is finished. He placed the envelope on the counter. No contract. No request. Just a letter. I looked at it, then at him. Did you write it yourself? With a fountain pen, he said. Badly. Against my better judgment, I almost smiled. He saw it, but he did not reach for it. That mattered. I opened the letter after he left. It was not perfect. Did not try to be. He wrote about the first night in the law office, about the clause, about the moment he realized the only decent promise he had made was the one he later broke. He did not ask me to come back. He only promised that Whitmore Development would fund a permanent small business preservation grant, controlled by an independent board, beginning with the blocks his company had once planned to erase. The next week, Nate returned to Harper Books as a customer. He bought a used novel with my mother's notes still tucked in a staff recommendation card. I poured 2 cups of mint tea, one for myself and one for him, and placed his on the counter instead of across from me. Not an invitation back into my life. Not yet. Just a beginning honest enough not to pretend it was an ending. He looked at the cup, then at me, and understood. Some stories do not close with a kiss or a signed agreement. Some close with a woman keeping her name, her store, her peace, and the door open only as far as trust has earned.